The world was falling apart. It wasn't a literal collapse, but a disintegration of the old ways of thinking and living. In the 19th century, everything seemed to be in flux. Artists, scientists, and thinkers were creating more than ever before, but their work felt like a jumbled mess. Henry Adams, a contemporary of Abraham Kuyper, described it this way: "Scores of artists, sculptors, painters, poets, and dramatists were at work, 1,000 times as actively as ever before, and the mass and originality of the product would have swamped any previous age, as it very nearly swamped its own. Steam engines, evolutionary theories, and liberal democracies were changing the world. People were excited by these new ideas, but they were also confused. It was like the world was being torn apart by 1,000 different forces, and no one knew how to put the pieces back together. In the midst of this chaos, Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch theologian and politician, saw an opportunity. He believed that the key to navigating this new world was unity, both in thought and in community. Kuyper was a Calvinist, a follower of John Calvin, who believed that God's will was sovereign over everything. But Kuyper saw that the old ways of thinking weren't enough. The world was changing, and Calvinism needed to change with it. Kuyper's vision was to create a unified Calvinist community that could engage with the modern world. He didn't want to retreat into a bubble. He wanted to be part of the conversation. He believed that every aspect of life, science, politics, economics, and the arts, should be informed by Calvinist principles. He often said, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" But Kuyper's approach wasn't just about enforcing old doctrines. He recognized that there were good things in the modern world, and he wanted Calvinists to embrace them. He believed in the idea of common grace, the notion that God's goodness could be seen even in the work of non-Christians. Kuyper encouraged his followers to recognize and appreciate the genuinely good achievements of others, while also being vigilant about identifying and challenging non-Christian ideas. Kuyper's strategy was to create a subculture, a unified group within a larger pluralistic society. He didn't want to create a new nation or a new church. He wanted to create a community of Calvinists who could live out their faith in the modern world. This was a radical idea at the time, and it wasn't without its critics. Some accused Kuyper of being too radical or even revolutionary, but he was clear that his goal was not to isolate, but to engage. The world was changing, and Kuyper was determined to lead his followers through the chaos. He believed that by maintaining a coherent system of thought and a unified community, Calvinists could thrive in the modern world. His ideas and the institutions he founded would have a lasting impact, not just in the Netherlands, but around the globe. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Kuyper's ideas were shaped by the complex relationship between the church, the state, and society in the Netherlands. We'll see how the separation of church and state, the rise of pluralism, and the growth of voluntary religion all played a role in Kuyper's development as a leader and a thinker. But for now, let's take a closer look at the man himself and how he came to embrace Calvinism. Abraham Kuyper was a man who believed in the power of the church, but not just any church. He envisioned a church that was free and vibrant, a place where people could truly connect with God and each other. Kuyper's journey began in the church, and it was there that he first saw the need for change. In his early days, he noticed that the church was often run by a small group of people who made all the decisions. Kuyper thought this was unfair and believed that everyone in the church should have a say in how it was run. He argued that the Holy Spirit guided the whole congregation, not just a select few, and that everyone should be involved in choosing their leaders. Kuyper's ideas about the church were revolutionary. He believed that the church should be separate from the state, meaning that the government shouldn't control how the church operates. This was a big deal because, at the time, many churches were closely tied to the government. Kuyper saw this as a problem because it limited the church's ability to be truly free and to follow God's will. He looked to America as an example of how a church could thrive when it was separate from the state. In America, churches were free to worship as they chose, and this led to a strong and vibrant religious community. Kuyper's vision for the church wasn't just about freedom. It was also about engagement. He believed that the church should be involved in all aspects of society. This meant that the church should be active in education, politics, and even the arts. Kuyper saw the church as a living organism that needed to be connected to the world around it. He believed that the church should be a place where people could grow and learn, and where they could make a positive impact on their communities. One of Kuyper's most important ideas was something he called sphere sovereignty. This concept was about recognizing that different parts of society, like the church, the government, and the family, each have their own unique roles and responsibilities. Kuyper believed that each of these spheres should be free to operate according to its own principles, without interference from the others. For example, the government shouldn't tell the church how to teach or worship, and the church shouldn't tell the government how to run the country. This idea was a way to ensure that each part of society could function well and contribute to the common good. Kuyper also had a strong belief in something he called common grace. This was the idea that God's grace isn't just for those who believe in Him, but it's also for everyone in the world. Common grace helps to restrain evil and allows people to develop the potential of creation. Kuyper saw this as a reason for Christians to be involved in the world, to work for justice, and to make the world a better place. He believed that even though the world is flawed, it still has the potential for good, and that Christians should be at the forefront of making that happen. Kuyper's ideas didn't just stay in the Netherlands. They spread to other parts of the world, including America. When Kuyper visited America in 1898, he gave a series of lectures at Princeton Seminary. His ideas about the church and society resonated with many Americans, especially those who were part of the Dutch immigrant community. These immigrants were trying to figure out how to maintain their Calvinist beliefs while also adapting to American culture. Kuyper's ideas about sphere sovereignty and common grace helped them navigate this challenge. Some of these Dutch Americans, like those in Grand Rapids, Michigan, embraced Kuyper's ideas and started their own schools, churches, and political organizations. Others, like those at Princeton and later at Westminster Seminary, incorporated Kuyper's ideas into their theology and teaching. In the Netherlands, Kuyper's ideas continued to shape the country's religious and political landscape. One of the most important figures in this movement was Herman Bavinck. Bavinck was a theologian who, like Kuyper, believed in the importance of a free and engaged church. However, Bavinck was more focused on bringing different groups together and finding common ground. He believed that while it was important to maintain strong Calvinist beliefs, it was also important to work with others to build a better society. Kuyper's legacy is a reminder that the church can be a powerful force for good in the world. His ideas about a free church, sphere sovereignty, and common grace continue to inspire people to think about how they can make a positive impact in their communities. Whether it's through education, politics, or the arts, Kuyper believed that every part of society has a role to play in building a better world. Herman Bavinck was a theologian who lived in the Netherlands during a time of great change. In 1892, the Christian Reformed Church merged with a group led by Abraham Kuyper, forming the Reformed churches in the Netherlands. Kuyper later became the prime minister in 1902, and Bavinck took over Kuyper's position in dogmatics at the Free University. Bavinck was a brilliant thinker, and his most important work was a 4-volume book called Reformed Dogmatics. He also received prestigious honors, like the Princeton Stone Lectures and membership in the Royal Netherlands Academy of the Arts and Sciences. Bavinck wasn't just a scholar, he was also involved in politics. In 1911, he became a member of Parliament. He wrote about a wide range of topics, from war and psychology to teaching. His work on education was especially important for the new neo-Calvinist schools, which, thanks to his political efforts, received equal funding from the government. Bavinck faced a big challenge: how to engage with a society that was becoming more diverse while still holding on to traditional Calvinist beliefs. Calvinism traditionally focused on the afterlife, but modern ethics were more about making life better in the present. Bavinck saw both sides of this issue and tried to find a balance. In a review of Albrecht Rich's theology, he described the tension between a life focused on God and a life focused on moral duties. He believed both views had value and contained truth, but he couldn't see a way to combine them. This tension was a common theme in late 19th century theology. Other theologians were also trying to reconcile traditional Christian faith with modern ethical ideas. Bavinck's approach was to acknowledge the value in both perspectives without fully resolving the conflict. In the early 20th century, a young pastor named Johannes Gielkerken raised questions about the historical accuracy of the Genesis story of Adam and Eve. He used Kuyper's idea of organic inspiration, which suggested that the Holy Spirit worked through the unique personalities of the human authors. Gielkerken admitted that the fall was a historical event, but questioned some elements, like the talking serpent. This was too much for the church, and Gielkerken was defrocked. His case showed how fragile the balance of neo-Calvinist reform could be, as he was a student of Kuyper and Bavinck and was using their ideas to challenge the church. Another challenge came from Karl Barth, a Swiss theologian. Barth's theology emphasized God's radical transcendence, which made some neo-Calvinists worried that Barth was making the Bible a human witness to divine revelation rather than revelation itself. Barth criticized neo-Calvinists for being too confident in their social actions and their comprehensive Christian worldview. He believed that provisional and practical judgments were the best approach. Barth and his followers, like Cornelis Haeckel Miscot, rejected the many Christian organizations established by neo-Calvinists. In South Africa, neo-Calvinist ideas were used to support apartheid, an oppressive system that segregated people based on race. While the religious roots of apartheid predated neo-Calvinism, the idea of sphere sovereignty from Kuyper was used to justify racial segregation. However, some neo-Calvinists, like Benny Keat, used Bavinck's ideas about the unity of the human race to oppose apartheid. The Free University in the Netherlands awarded honorary degrees to Martin Luther, King Jr., and Beyers Naud for their work in racial reconciliation. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, neo-Calvinism gained influence in American evangelical circles. It offered a model for conservative Protestants to re-engage with public life after their parents had disengaged. Calvin College and theologians like Richard Mouw and James K. A. Smith have been key figures in this revival. Neoptolemism has inspired many Christians to engage with a secular, pluralistic world, but it has faced challenges in creating a coherent and unified social system. The movement is often seen as eclectic and fragmented, with a strong focus on ethics but less emphasis on traditional theological topics like the Trinity and Christology. Max Weber, a sociologist, warned about the dangers of Calvinism's intense focus on ethics. He feared that the iron cage of material goods and work would weigh heavily on people's lives. Neoptolecal-Calvinism's emphasis on active transformational work might not lead to a meaningful life if it displaces contemplation, study, and worship. For a balanced Christian life, there needs to be a work ethic and a rest ethic. Despite these challenges, Neo-Calvinism continues to inspire many Christians to engage with the world. The future of Neo-Calvinism will depend on finding a balance between active engagement and contemplative reflection. Karl Barth, a famous theologian, had a unique journey with John Calvin the Reformer. Before 1922, Barth didn't really focus on Calvin, even though he was part of the Swiss Reformed Church. He had served as a pastor in Geneva, where Calvin lived, but he didn't feel a strong connection to Calvin's ideas at that time. Barth even admitted that he thought he could mix his own ideas with Calvin's without much conflict. In 1921, Barth got a job as a professor at the University of Göttingen. This was a time of great change in Germany. The country was facing serious problems like high inflation and political unrest. It was a challenging time, and Barth felt that Germany was like the poor Lazarus from the Bible, not the rich man. Barth's job at the university required him to study and teach about the Reformed tradition, which is where Calvin's ideas are central. In the spring of 1922, Barth started his first series of lectures on Calvin. He talked about Calvin's life and ideas for a few hours each week. This was the first time he really dove deep into Calvin's work. During the fall of 1922, Barth gave a talk called The Problem of Essek Today. This talk was a summary of what he had learned from his lectures. He was trying to understand how Calvin's ideas could help people in the difficult times they were facing. Barth's lectures on Calvin were not as complete as he had hoped. He wanted to cover all of Calvin's ideas, but he only managed to talk about Calvin's life up to 1541. He told a friend that his lectures were a monstrosity because they mixed biography, theology, and history all together. Despite this, Barth continued to think about Calvin's ideas and how they could be relevant to modern times. After his time at Göttingen, Barth continued to teach about Calvin in different places, like Munster, Bonn, and Basel. He held reading seminars where he and his students would discuss Calvin's works. These seminars were important because they allowed Barth to keep exploring Calvin's ideas. Barth's lecture on ethics was especially important because it showed how he was trying to connect Calvin's ideas to the problems people were facing in the 1920s. He believed that Calvin's theology could help people understand their world better and find ways to live ethically. The places where Barth gave his lectures were also important. He spoke at universities, churches, and other gatherings. This shows that he was trying to reach a wide audience and bring Calvin's ideas to different groups of people. By doing this, Barth was not just teaching about the past, but was also trying to make Calvin's ideas relevant to the present. Barth's Calvin was not just a historical figure, but a modern thinker who could help people understand the challenges of their time. Barth saw Calvin as a Weimar prophet, someone whose ideas could speak to the modern world. This is why Barth's early engagement with Calvin is so important. He was not just studying the past, but was using Calvin's ideas to address the problems of his own time. Karl Barth's journey through Germany and Switzerland in the early 1920s was a whirlwind of lectures and discussions. His audiences were diverse, ranging from city preachers in Wiesbaden to Reformed churchmen in Emden. In each place, Barth delivered his lecture on ethics, but the reception varied widely. In Wiesbaden, he spoke to preachers burdened by the challenges of modern city life. In Lüneburg, he faced a group of Richlands who were so rigid in their beliefs that Barth described them as petrified and toothless. In Emden, he found a solemn gathering of Reformed churchmen, each sitting in their own easy chair with portraits of 16th-century theologians looking down disapprovingly. In Nordhorn, near the Dutch border, he encountered a group of fervent followers of Hermann Kohlbrugge, a confessional Reformed leader. Finally, in Bochum, he lectured to a group of Lutherans, where one attendee commented that Luther was right to refuse to shake Zwingli's hand. Throughout this exhausting series of lectures, Barth traveled by express trains and D trains, often waiting in stations with a pipe that rarely went out. He was deeply engaged with the work of John Calvin, and his approach to presenting Calvin was both strategic and dramatic. Barth believed that Calvin had one central message: Jesus Christ. However, to make this message relevant to the modern age, Calvin needed to be recast as a contemporary figure. Barth explained, "The historical Calvin is the living Calvin who wanted to say something specific, one thing, and who still wants to say it, perhaps in a way that he could not do in his lifetime." Barth's goal was to make Calvin seem strange and even terrifying to his audiences. He described his delivery as menacingly impressive, and his lectures were indeed powerful. One observer noted that Barth had shot the bird, and another confirmed that the lecture was a real broadside blast. By presenting Calvin in this way, Barth aimed to shock and disturb his listeners, to make them think deeply about the relevance of Calvin's message in their own lives. Barth's portrayal of Calvin was influenced by a variety of sources, including the expressionist style of his second edition of the Epistle to the Romans. This style was characterized by its intense, lyrical, and sometimes volcanic prose, which made the prevailing theology seem stale by comparison. Barth also drew inspiration from the works of novelists like Hermann Hesse and Stefan Zweig, as well as sociologists like Max Weber. He saw these thinkers as pessimists, grumblers, and literati, who shared a deep anxiety about the modern world. By placing Calvin in this context, Barth hoped to present him as a figure who could speak directly to the challenges of the Weimar era. In a letter to his friend Thurneson, Barth described his approach to teaching Reformed theology. "The little bit of Reformed theology that I teach is really nothing in comparison to the trumpet blast which needs to be blown in our sick time." He compared Calvin to a cataract, a primeval forest, and a demonic power, something absolutely Chinese, strange, mythological. Barth felt that he lacked the means to fully assimilate or present Calvin's ideas, but he was deeply committed to the task. He wrote, "I could gladly and profitably set myself down and spend all the rest of my life just with Calvin." Barth's language in this letter echoed the work of Hermann Hesse, who had used similar imagery to describe the characters in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Hesse saw these characters as representing an Asiatic ideal that could be a source of renewal for European culture. Barth, in turn, used this imagery to present Calvin as an alien and otherworldly figure, disconnected from the modern world and thus free from its sickness. This romantic and modernist portrayal of Calvin was not unique to Barth. Many European intellectuals of the time were turning to Eastern wisdom and primitive sources for inspiration. Writers like Hesse and Dostoevsky were widely read, and their works were seen as offering a path to a new, more authentic way of living. Barth, influenced by these trends, sought to present Calvin as a prophet who could speak to the anxieties of the modern world. In his lectures, Barth often emphasized the severity and asceticism of Calvin, drawing on Max Weber's influential work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber had portrayed Calvin as a stern and pessimistic figure, and Barth adopted this image, describing Calvin's lack of humor and his intense devotion to his cause. He compared Calvin to Bernard of Clairvaux, a medieval monk who was so focused on his spiritual mission that he could ride the length of Lake Geneva without noticing its beauty. By presenting Calvin in this way, Barth hoped to challenge his audiences to reconsider their own lives and the world around them. He wanted to make Calvin a living, dynamic force, one that could electrify and transform those who encountered it. Through his lectures and writings, Barth sought to bring Calvin's message to a new generation, adapting it to the needs and challenges of the modern age. Karl Barth, a famous theologian, had a unique way of understanding John Calvin, one of the key figures of the Reformation. While many people saw Calvin as a strict, old-fashioned theologian, Barth saw him as a passionate prophetic voice, much like the prophets of the Old Testament. Barth believed that to truly understand Calvin's work, you had to understand the man himself. He thought that Calvin's life and his theology were deeply intertwined. For Barth, Calvin was not just a thinker, but a person shaped by his beliefs and the world around him. This idea of personality, or what Barth called Persönlichkeit, was crucial. It meant that Calvin was driven by a strong set of values and beliefs that guided his actions and thoughts. Calvin's message was often severe and uncompromising. Barth compared him to the Old Testament prophets like Elijah and Jeremiah. These prophets were known for their fierce and sometimes harsh messages. Calvin, according to Barth, was the same. He was not someone who tried to make things easy or comfortable. Instead, he was a man of strong conviction, often delivering messages of judgment and warning. Calvin's severity was rooted in his deep theological beliefs. He saw a stark contrast between the finite, sinful world and the infinite, perfect God. For Calvin, the world was a place of crisis, and human life was inherently flawed. This view was not just about Calvin's personality, but was a reflection of his theology. He believed that the only hope for humanity was in God's grace and the promise of salvation. Despite the severity of Calvin's message, Barth saw a deeper, more hopeful side. He believed that the harshness of Calvin's theology was a way to point to the ultimate reality of God's love and grace. This idea is what Barth called the dialectic of the thought of God. It means that the negative aspects of human existence, like sin and death, are ultimately overcome by the positive, redeeming power of God. For Barth, the center of Calvin's theology was Jesus Christ. Christ was the bridge between the finite and the infinite, the way in which God's love and grace could reach humanity. This was the real reality that Barth believed Calvin pointed to. Through the harshness of the world, the love of God is revealed, and through the awareness of sin, forgiveness is possible. Barth's interpretation of Calvin was influenced by both modernist and classical ideas. He was a man of his times, living in the early 20th century, a period marked by significant cultural and intellectual changes. His approach to Calvin was not just a return to the past, but a reimagining of it. He saw Calvin as a modern prophet, someone who spoke to the challenges of his own time. The Weimar Republic, the period in which Barth was writing, was a time of great social and political upheaval. Barth's portrayal of Calvin was influenced by this context. He presented Calvin as a figure who could speak to the crises of his own day, much like the prophets of old. This modernist approach did not replace Barth's appreciation for classical theology, but rather incorporated it into a new, more dynamic framework. Barth's interpretation of Calvin has had a lasting impact on how people understand the Reformer. He presented Calvin as a complex, multifaceted figure, not just a strict theologian, but a passionate, prophetic voice. This image of Calvin has influenced many theologians and scholars, helping to reshape the way we think about the Reformation and its relevance today. By understanding Calvin through the lens of his personality and the theological context of his time, Barth offered a new and compelling way to engage with one of the most influential figures in Christian history. The Korean Presbyterian Church, which is a big part of the Korean Church, has a rich history that goes back to the late 1800s. Understanding this history helps us see how Calvinism, a type of Christian belief, has shaped the church in Korea. In the 1880s, the first foreign missionaries came to Korea. One of the first was Dr. Horace Newton Allen, who arrived in 1884. He was followed by others like Horace, Grant, Underwood, and Henry Gerhard Appenzeller. These missionaries were from different parts of the world, like America and Australia, and they all helped to spread Christianity in Korea. Interestingly, the first Korean church wasn't started by these missionaries. It was started by a Korean man named Sang Ryun Seo in 1883. Seo was a Bible seller, and he used the first Korean translations of the Bible to start a church in a place called Seorae. This was possible because of the help of a Scottish missionary named John Ross, who translated parts of the Bible into Korean. With the help of the missionaries, the Korean Presbyterian Church started to grow. In 1907, the first official institution of the Korean Presbyterian Church was formed. This was called the Seoul Presbytery, and it had 78 members, including Korean elders and foreign missionaries. They oversaw 989 local churches and had about 70,000 Christians, with 19,000 baptized members. By 1912, the church had grown so much that they formed the first General Assembly. This was a big meeting where they decided on important matters for the church. They adopted the 12 Articles of Faith as their main beliefs and decided to follow the Presbyterian way of organizing the church. At this time, they had over 2,000 local churches and more than 120,000 people attending. The growth of the church was not without challenges. In 1910, Japan took control of Korea, and this brought a lot of problems for the Korean Presbyterian Church. The Japanese wanted the Koreans to worship at Japanese shrines, which was against the Christian beliefs. In 1940, the church made a decision to expel foreign missionaries who opposed this, and they started to worship at the shrines. This was a very difficult time for the church. After Korea gained independence in 1945, there were big conflicts in the church. Some people had participated in the shrine worship, while others had resisted and were even put in prison. This led to a split in the church. In 1952, those who had resisted formed their own General Assembly, called the Presbyterian Church of Korea, Kosen. In 1953, the church faced another split. This time it was because of different ideas about theology. Some people in the church, called the liberals, had different beliefs about the Bible and didn't agree with the traditional Reformed theology. They had even compromised with the Japanese requirement to worship at shrines. The conservatives, who followed the traditional beliefs, didn't agree with this and wanted to close the theological seminary that the liberals were running. This led to another split, and the liberals formed their own denomination called the Presbyterian Church in the Republic of Korea, Kijang. In the Korean Presbyterian Church, confessions of faith are very important. These are documents that explain what the church believes. The first one was the 12 Articles of Faith, which was adopted in 1912. Later, the church adopted the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is a detailed explanation of Reformed beliefs. The Church also uses other Reformed confessions like the Canons of Dort and the Belgic Confession. These confessions help to keep the Church united in its beliefs and provide a clear understanding of what it means to be a Presbyterian in Korea. They are based on the teachings of John Calvin, a famous theologian from the 16th century whose ideas have been very influential in the Presbyterian Church. Calvinism, which is the set of beliefs based on John Calvin's teachings, has played a big role in the Korean Presbyterian Church. In Korea, Calvinism is often understood through the Westminster Confession of Faith, Calvin's Institutes, and the 5 points of Calvinism known as TULIP. These points are about total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Calvinism has shaped the way the Korean Presbyterian Church understands God, the Bible, and the world. It has influenced how they worship, how they teach, and how they live their lives. Even though there have been challenges and divisions, the core beliefs of Calvinism continue to be a central part of the Korean Presbyterian Church. Understanding the history and the beliefs of the Korean Presbyterian Church helps us see how important Calvinism is in the life of the Church. It has been a guiding light through the ups and downs of Korean history, and it continues to shape the Church today. The story of the Korean Presbyterian Church, KPC, is a rich tapestry of faith, division, and growth. From its early days, the KPC has been shaped by the influence of missionaries, theological debates, and the complex dynamics of Korean society. Let's explore how the KPC evolved, focusing on its foundational creed, the role of the Westminster Standards, and the development of Calvinism in the Korean context. In the late 19th century, Presbyterian missionaries from the United States and other countries began their work in Korea. These missionaries were deeply rooted in the Reformed tradition, which emphasizes the sovereignty of God, the authority of the Bible, and a need for personal salvation. One of the key figures among these missionaries was John Nevius, who advocated for the Nephius method. This approach emphasized Bible studies and education, with the goal of training Korean leaders to take charge of the church. In 1890, 7 Presbyterian missionaries held a conference to discuss mission strategies. They invited John Nevius, who spoke about the importance of establishing a theological school to train Korean leaders. Following this method, the missionaries provided the KPC with the necessary theological education and creeds. In 1902, the missionaries formed the Committee on Translation of Church Standards to create a confession of faith for the KPC. By 1905, they decided to adopt the 12 Articles as the official creed, along with the Westminster Shorter Catechism as the standard of faith. The 12 Articles were originally written for the Indian Presbyterian Church in 1904, but were chosen for the KPC due to their broad evangelical appeal. The preface to the 12 Articles states that while the KPC adopts these articles, it does not reject the historical Reformed confessions like the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Welsh Calvinistic Confession, and the Canons of Dort. Instead, these confessions are commended as worthy exponents of the Word of God. The KPC's adoption of the 12 Articles in the Westminster Shorter Catechism laid the groundwork for a strong Reformed foundation. However, the journey to fully integrate the Westminster Confession of Faith into the KPC was a gradual process. In the 1960s, the major denominations of the KPC began to adopt the Westminster Confession. For example, the Hapdong denomination adopted the Confession in 1963, but it wasn't included in their constitution until 1993. The Colson denomination adopted the original 1647 version in 1969, but later switched to the 1903 revision in 1975. The Tonghap denomination also adopted the 1903 revision, But some conservative members were concerned about the 1967 revision, which they saw as a departure from Reformed theology. The KPC has not been immune to theological debates and divisions. One significant division occurred in the 1950s when the KPC split into two main groups, the Hapdong and the Tonghap. The Hapdong group was more conservative and opposed the KPC's participation in the World Christian Council, WCC, while the Tonghap group supported it. The Tonghap denomination, influenced by neo-orthodoxy, sought to formulate its own confession of faith. In 1986, they drafted the Confession of Faith of the Presbyterian Church of Korea, and in 1997, they added the 21st Confession of Faith. The Kijang denomination, known for its more liberal stance, never adopted the Westminster Confession. They argued that the confession was too scholastic and legalistic, and that the KPC should create its own confession to better reflect the modern context. The early KPC was characterized by a strong Reformed and Calvinistic influence. The missionaries who founded the KPC were conservative and fundamentalist, emphasizing the authority of the Bible and the need for personal salvation. This influence was evident in the theological training provided at Pyongyang Theological Seminary, the first school established by the missionaries in 1901. However, as the KPC grew and evolved, it faced internal debates about the nature of Reformed theology. Some denominations, like the Hapdong in Kosin, remained strongly committed to traditional Reformed doctrine, while others, like the Tonghap and Kijang, sought to adapt and modernize their theology. The Korean Presbyterian Church has a rich and complex history, shaped by the influence of missionary work, theological debates, and the evolving needs of Korean society. While the KPC has been deeply rooted in Reformed theology, it has also grappled with the challenges of maintaining its traditional roots while adapting to new contexts. The story of the KPC is one of faith, division, and continuous growth, reflecting the dynamic nature of the Christian faith in Korea.